Ethan had always believed that love was about compromise, about two people merging their lives together and learning to embrace each other's differences. But as he watched Claire wrinkle her nose at Max, the large German shepherd sprawled across his living room floor, he wondered if there were some compromises too big to make. Does he have to be inside all the time? Claire sighed, crossing her arms as Max lifted his head, ears perking up at the sound of her voice. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck, feeling the familiar tension creeping in. Claire, it's his home too. He's always been an inside dog. Claire exhaled sharply, her fingers tapping against her arm in irritation. He's huge, Ethan. He sheds everywhere. He smells, and he's always staring at me. It's unsettling. Max, as if sensing he was the subject of the conversation, let out a small huff before resting his head back on his paws. Ethan reached down instinctively, running a hand through Max's thick fur, feeling the warmth of his most loyal companion beneath his palm. He's not staring at you, Ethan said with a small laugh, trying to lighten the mood. He's just watching. He's protective. Claire rolled her eyes and took a step back as Max shifted slightly, his tail thumping against the floor. I get that you love him, but I'm not comfortable around dogs, especially big ones like him. Can't he just stay outside when I'm here? There it was, the ultimatum wrapped in a simple request. Ethan's stomach twisted. Max had been with him for years, through breakups, job changes, and even the death of his father. The dog had curled up beside him on lonely nights, licked the tears from his face when life became too heavy, and greeted him every single day, as if Ethan were the best thing to ever exist. Max wasn't just a dog, he was family. Ethan took a careful breath, glancing between Claire and Max. He loved Claire, deeply, madly, and in a way that made him believe in forever. But he also knew that love, real love, meant accepting all of someone, not just the parts that were easy. I don't know if I can do that, Claire, he admitted, his voice softer than he intended. Max has always been inside. He's part of my life. Claire's jaw tightened, and I'm supposed to just deal with that. Ethan hesitated. I was hoping maybe over time, you'd warm up to him. Claire let out a dry laugh, shaking her head. Ethan, I'm never going to be a dog person. I don't like the mess, the barking, the fur. I love you, but I don't love this. She gestured toward Max, who lazily blinked up at her before closing his eyes again. Ethan felt the weight of her words press against his chest. He had always imagined a future with Claire, marriage, kids, a home filled with love and laughter. But in every version of that dream, Max was there too. Could he really envision a life where he had to choose between them? Claire stepped closer, placing her hands on Ethan's chest, her voice softening. I just want us to have a home that feels clean, peaceful, and I can't have that with him in the house. Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat. I need to think about it. Claire sighed, stepping back, but she didn't push further. Okay, just think fast. We're planning a wedding, Ethan. We need to be on the same page about what our life will look like. She grabbed her coat, pausing briefly at the door. I'll call you later. And then she was gone, leaving Ethan standing in the middle of his living room, the air heavy with unspoken words. Max lifted his head, letting out a quiet whine, as if he could feel the shift in the atmosphere. Ethan knelt beside him, scratching behind his ears. What do I do, buddy? He whispered. Max licked his hand in response, his eyes full of the unwavering love that had never once wavered, not in all the years they had been together. Ethan sighed, his heart warring with itself. He loved Claire, but he had never considered what it would mean to love someone who couldn't love the thing he cherished most. And for the first time since their engagement, he wasn't sure if love would be enough. Ethan sat on the edge of his couch, staring at the spot where Claire had stood just moments ago. The air still carried the faint scent of her perfume, yet it felt as if an invisible wall had risen between them. His heart was heavy, tangled in a web of emotions. Love for Claire, devotion to Max, and a growing sense of unease. Max, ever intuitive, nudged his snout under Ethan's hand, his deep brown eyes searching his owner's face. Ethan let out a long sigh and ruffled the dog's ears, seeking comfort in the familiar warmth of his fur. What am I supposed to do, Max? Ethan murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Max responded with a soft whimper, resting his large head on Ethan's lap. The ultimatum lingered in Ethan's mind, pressing down on him like a weight he hadn't asked to carry. Could he really sacrifice his bond with Max for the sake of a future with Claire? Would Claire ever truly be happy sharing a home with a dog she barely tolerated? He loved Claire. There was no doubt about that. But love, as much as people romanticized it, wasn't always easy. Ethan ran a hand over his face, rubbing his tired eyes. He needed to clear his head. Grabbing Max's leash, he clipped it onto the dog's collar. "Come on, bud. Let's go for a walk." Max perked up instantly, his tail thumping against the couch. He trotted eagerly to the door as Ethan slipped on his jacket, the crisp night air greeting them as they stepped outside. The streets were quiet, illuminated by the golden glow of streetlights. Their footsteps echoed along the pavement as Ethan let Max lead the way, his mind drifting between the past and the uncertain future ahead. He remembered the day he had brought Max home. He had been just a pup back then, a clumsy, oversized ball of energy with paws too big for his body. Ethan had adopted him after a particularly rough year, and from that moment, Max had been more than just a pet. He had been family. How could he even think about giving that up? They passed by the coffee shop where Ethan had first met Claire, a memory surfacing unbidden. She had been reading a book, her nose scrunched in concentration, a look of fierce determination in her eyes that had made him stop in his tracks. He had fallen for her so fast, so completely, that he hadn't thought to question whether their lives would truly fit together. Now, standing at a crossroads, he had to ask himself the hard question. Was love enough when their visions of the future were so different? Max suddenly tugged at the leash, pulling Ethan out of his thoughts. His ears were perked, his stance alert. "What is it, boy?" Ethan followed Max's gaze, expecting to see a stray cat or another dog in the distance. But there was nothing. Max let out a low whine, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. Then, as if making up his mind about something, he turned back toward home, trotting ahead with an unusual sense of urgency. Ethan frowned, following the dog's lead. When they reached the apartment, Max rushed to the front door, sniffing around before sitting down and staring up at Ethan expectantly. All right, Ethan muttered, unlocking the door and stepping inside. Max patted in behind him but didn't go straight for his water bowl like he usually did. Instead, he remained near the door, ears high, eyes locked on Ethan. Ethan shook his head. "You're acting weird tonight, buddy." Max let out another soft whine, then nudged Ethan's hand before trotting over to Claire's coat, which still hung on the rack. He sniffed it, then looked back at Ethan, tail twitching. Ethan chuckled dryly. "Yeah, I know, you're not her biggest fan, huh?" Max didn't respond the way he usually did. No wagging tail, no excited huff, just an intense stare, as if he was trying to tell Ethan something. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know what to do, Max," he admitted. "I love her, but I love you too. And I don't think she'll ever change her mind about you." Max tilted his head, his expression unreadable. Ethan stood there for a long moment, the silence stretching between them. The thought of a life without Max in it felt like a wound he couldn't begin to imagine healing. Yet the idea of losing Claire, of walking away from the future they had been building together, felt equally unbearable. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Claire. His heart clenched as he stared at the screen. He knew she wanted an answer, but the truth was, he wasn't sure he had one yet. He sank onto the couch, Max jumping up beside him, resting his head against Ethan's leg. For the first time since Claire had given him the ultimatum, Ethan allowed himself to consider a possibility he had been too afraid to acknowledge. What if love wasn't enough? What if in the end some things simply couldn't be compromised? Ethan woke up to the rhythmic sound of Max's tail thumping against the bed. The morning sunlight streamed through the blinds, painting the room in golden hues. For a moment, he let himself forget the turmoil of the previous night, the weight of the decision still hanging over him like a storm cloud. Max let out a low whine, nudging Ethan's arm. All right, I'm up," Ethan mumbled, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. He reached over and scratched behind Max's ears. "You're way too eager for someone who doesn't have to worry about relationships." Max huffed in response, his ears twitching. Ethan grabbed his phone, his stomach twisting when he saw Claire's name at the top of his notifications. A single message. Asterisk. Asterisk. We need to talk. Asterisk. Asterisk. Ethan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He wasn't ready for it. Not yet. Sliding out of bed, he went about his morning routine, trying to shake the tension from his shoulders. But something was off. Max, usually bouncing around in excitement at the thought of breakfast, wasn't acting like himself. He stood in the hallway, staring toward the front door, his posture tense. Ethan frowned. "What is it, bud?" Max turned, sniffed the air, then walked to the coat rack where Claire's jacket still hung. He nosed at it, then sat down and let out a quiet, insistent whine. "Still not a fan of her, huh?" Ethan joked, though his chest tightened. Max didn't respond the way he usually did. No tail wag, no excited jumps, just an unwavering stare. A strange sense of unease settled in Ethan's stomach. He crouched beside Max, placing a hand on the dog's side. "You're acting weird," he murmured. Max leaned into him, pressing his warm body against Ethan's side. Something was wrong. Ethan grabbed his phone and hesitated before finally calling Claire. She picked up on the third ring. "Hey," she said, her voice tired. "Hey," Ethan replied, leaning against the kitchen counter. "You okay?" Claire sighed. "Yeah, just a lot on my mind." Ethan nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "Yeah, me too." A pause stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. "Ethan," Claire's voice softened. "I know last night was tense. I don't want to fight with you. I don't want to fight either," he admitted. "But I don't think this is something we can just push aside." Claire exhaled. "Can we meet later? Talk face to face?" Ethan hesitated, glancing down at Max, who was still staring at the coat rack. Yeah, of course. Okay," Claire said. "I'll see you tonight." When Ethan hung up, Max let out a soft whine and nosed his leg. "Guess we'll see how this goes, huh?" Ethan muttered. Max, as always, didn't have an answer, but his posture remained tense, his gaze never straying far from Claire's scent. That evening, Ethan sat at a small cafe, waiting for Claire. Max had been restless all day, pacing by the door and whining every time Claire's name was mentioned. It was starting to unsettle Ethan, more than he wanted to admit. He glanced up as Claire walked in. She looked beautiful, as she always did. Dark curls tucked behind her ears, a soft blue sweater hugging her frame. But there was a tension in her shoulders, in the way she bit her lip as she sat down. "Hey," Ethan said. "Hey." Claire offered a small smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. Silence stretched between them before she finally spoke. "I love you, Ethan," she said, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "I want us to work, but I don't think I can live with a dog in the house." Ethan's chest tightened. "Max's family, Claire. He's not just a pet." Claire looked away. "I know, and I know this isn't fair to you, but it's how I feel." Ethan stared at her, searching for something, some sign that she might be willing to compromise, but there was none. "Are you asking me to choose?" he asked quietly. Claire met his gaze, sadness swimming in her brown eyes. "I don't want to," she whispered, "but I don't know if I can change how I feel." Ethan swallowed hard, his hands clenching into fists beneath the table. For the first time, he saw the future stretching ahead of them. And in that future, Max wasn't there. Could he really live with that? Before he could respond, Claire shifted, brushing a hand over her stomach. Max's odd behavior flashed through Ethan's mind. The sniffing, the whining, the way he wouldn't leave Claire alone. "Claire," he said suddenly, "have you been feeling okay?" She blinked. "What?" "Max has been acting strange around you," Ethan explained. "He keeps sniffing at you, whining, acting anxious. I read something about dogs detecting illnesses." Claire groaned, rubbing her temples. "Ethan, please don't tell me you think your dog is some kind of medical expert." "I'm serious," Ethan said, leaning forward. "Just humor me. Go get a checkup." Claire sighed. "Ethan, please," he urged. "If not for me, then for Max. He's never acted like this before." Claire stared at him for a long moment, before finally exhaling. "Fine," she said, shaking her head. "If it'll make you stop worrying, I'll go. Relief flooded Ethan's chest. Thank you. She rolled her eyes. You owe me for this. Ethan forced a small smile. Deal. But as Claire sipped her coffee, Ethan couldn't shake the uneasy feeling settling deep in his gut, because something told him Max knew something they didn't. Ethan couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in his gut as he watched Claire sip her coffee, her expression unreadable. He knew she thought this was ridiculous, getting checked out just because a dog had been acting weird around her. But something about Max's behavior felt urgent. He had never seen his dog like this before, and he couldn't just ignore it. The next morning, Ethan stood at the kitchen counter, scrolling mindlessly through his phone, while Max sat by the door, ears pricked. Every time the leash so much as rustled, Max's tail would wag once, then stop as he realized Claire wasn't there. She's not coming over, buddy, Ethan muttered, tossing his phone onto the counter with a sigh. Max didn't move, his eyes stayed locked on the door, his posture tense. It had been like this all morning. Ethan ran a hand over his face. I don't know what's going on with you, but you're freaking me out. Max whined softly, his nails clicking against the hardwood floor as he shifted his weight. Ethan shook his head and grabbed his keys. All right, come on, let's go for a drive. Max bounded out the door, his usual excitement returning the second they got outside. The crisp air carried the sense of autumn, wet leaves, distant bonfires, and the sharp bite of oncoming winter. Ethan had no real destination in mind, but he found himself heading toward Claire's apartment anyway. He didn't even realize what he was doing until he was parked outside her building, Max whining softly in the passenger seat. Ethan sighed. You don't give up, do you? Max huffed, pressing his nose against the window. With a reluctant groan, Ethan grabbed his phone and texted Claire. Ethan, hey, did you make that doctor's appointment yet? He didn't expect an immediate response, but his phone vibrated almost instantly. Claire, just got here. Sitting in the waiting room now. Ethan exhaled, relief flooding his chest. Ethan, good. Let me know how it goes. He hesitated before typing out another message. Ethan, love you. The dots indicating her reply appeared, then disappeared. A long pause, then finally, Claire, love you too. Ethan stared at the screen, trying to shake the unease creeping up his spine. He turned to Max, who was still staring at the building like he could see straight through the walls. You happy now? Ethan asked. Max's tail wagged, but it was slow, unsure. Something still didn't feel right. Claire sat in the sterile doctor's office, flipping through a wrinkled magazine without actually reading it. This was ridiculous. She was perfectly fine. Sure, she'd been feeling more tired than usual lately, but that was normal, wasn't it? She was planning a wedding, juggling work, dealing with stress. It wasn't like she was sick. Her mind drifted back to Max, to the way he had pressed his nose against her stomach like he was trying to tell her something. Dogs did weird things all the time, didn't they? The door swung open, and a doctor in a crisp white coat walked in, glancing down at the chart in her hands. Claire, good to see you. Claire offered a tight smile. You too. The doctor settled into the chair across from her. So what brings you in today? Claire hesitated, suddenly feeling ridiculous. My fiancé's dog keeps sniffing me. The doctor's eyebrows lifted. Excuse me? Claire sighed, rubbing the back of her neck. I know, it sounds insane, but Max, his dog, he won't leave me alone. He keeps sniffing my stomach, whining at me, acting off. And Ethan, my fiancé, insisted I get checked just in case. The doctor smiled gently. Dogs do have incredible noses. They can pick up all sorts of things we don't. Claire shifted uncomfortably. Yeah, I read that too. But I mean, I feel fine. Maybe just a little tired, but that's normal, right? The doctor's smile didn't fade, but she leaned forward slightly. Why don't we run a few tests, just to be sure? Claire hesitated, then nodded. All right, can't hurt. 15 minutes later, she was in an examination room, staring at the ceiling while a technician performed an ultrasound. She wasn't pregnant, she knew that much. So why did she suddenly feel so nervous? The technician's brow furrowed slightly as they moved the wand over her abdomen. Claire sat up slightly. Is everything okay? The technician hesitated. I'm not a doctor, but I think we should have someone look at this. Claire's stomach dropped. Her fingers clenched the sides of the examination table as the weight of the moment settled over her. For the first time, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, Max hadn't been acting so strange for no reason. Ethan was halfway through making dinner when his phone rang. Claire, he answered instantly.
Hey, how did...
I need you to come to the hospital, Claire interrupted, her voice tight. Ethan's heart stuttered.
What? Why?
I don't know all the details yet, she admitted, but they found something. I need to stay for more tests. Ethan grabbed his keys without another thought. I'm on my way. Max, who had been lying by the door, jumped up instantly, as if he could sense the urgency in Ethan's voice. Ethan didn't waste a second. He didn't even remember the drive to the hospital. It was a blur of red lights and honking horns, his fingers clenching the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. When he finally got there, Claire was sitting in a hospital bed, staring at the wall. Her hands were clasped together in her lap, her knuckles pale. Ethan rushed over, heart hammering. Claire, she looked up at him, and for the first time since he'd met her, he saw fear in her eyes. They think I have cancer. The words crashed over him like a tidal wave, knocking the breath from his lungs. He sank into the chair beside her, his mind racing. What? Claire swallowed, her throat bobbing. Ovarian cancer. They found a mass. They're doing more tests, but they said if I hadn't come in this early. Her voice trailed off. Ethan reached for her hand, gripping it tightly. You're gonna be okay, he said, even though his chest felt like it was caving in. They caught it early, right? That's a good thing. Claire nodded, blinking rapidly. Yeah, they did. A tear slipped down her cheek. Ethan cupped her face, wiping it away. And then, in a moment of clarity, he whispered, Max knew. Claire let out a watery laugh, shaking her head. I can't believe it. Ethan smiled, pressing his forehead against hers. I can. Max had known all along. He had tried to tell them, and now, Claire had a fighting chance. Because of him. Ethan exhaled, pulling Claire into his arms. And for the first time in days, despite the fear and uncertainty, he felt hope. Ethan sat beside Claire's hospital bed, his fingers loosely laced with hers. The soft hum of machines and the occasional murmur of nurses in the hallway were the only sounds in the room. It had been hours since the doctor first confirmed it. Early-stage ovarian cancer. The words still didn't feel real, like they belonged to someone else's life, not theirs. Max. Ethan kept replaying everything in his head. Max had known. He had tried to warn them, again and again. Claire let out a shaky breath, breaking the silence. I always thought he hated me. Her voice was quiet, fragile. But he was trying to save me, wasn't he? Ethan turned to her, his eyes soft. Yeah, he murmured. He was. Claire pressed her lips together, her gaze unfocused. I never even gave him a chance, and he still tried to help me. Ethan felt his throat tighten. Claire wasn't the kind of person who admitted she was wrong easily. Seeing her this vulnerable, this open, was a side of her he rarely saw. A knock at the door startled them both. Ethan turned as a nurse peeked her head in. Sorry to interrupt, she said, offering a small smile. But you have a visitor. Ethan frowned. A visitor. Before the nurse could answer, the door pushed open a little further. A familiar set of paws patted against the tile floor. Max. Ethan's heart clenched. The hospital didn't usually allow pets, but somehow someone had made an exception. The moment Max saw Claire, his ears perked up, his tail wagging slightly. His steps were hesitant at first, as if he wasn't sure if he was allowed to approach. Claire's hand flew to her mouth. Her eyes welled up with tears. Oh, Max. Max made his decision then. He trotted forward, his nose immediately pressing into Claire's side, right where he had been sniffing for weeks. A low whine left him, as he curled himself against her, his body warm and solid. Claire let out a choked laugh, as she ran her fingers through his fur. I'm so sorry, she whispered, her voice breaking. I didn't see you. Max huffed, licking her wrist gently, as if to say, I forgive you. Ethan exhaled, the tightness in his chest finally loosening. Somehow, in the midst of all of this, Max had found a way to bridge the gap that had existed between him and Claire for so long. Claire wiped at her eyes, looking up at Ethan with a small watery smile. "You really do have the best dog in the world." Ethan grinned, scratching behind Max's ears. "I know." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of tests, consultations, and treatment plans. The doctors were optimistic. Since they had caught it early, Claire's chances of recovery were high. Ethan did his best to stay strong, but it was hard. Seeing Claire exhausted from the tests, watching her face pale after difficult conversations with doctors, it made him feel helpless in a way he wasn't used to. Max, however, never wavered. Wherever Claire was, he was there too. He lay beside her on the couch when she was too tired to move, his head resting on her lap. He sat by the door when she went in for appointments, waiting anxiously for her return. And at night, when Claire's mind was filled with fear and uncertainty, Max curled up at the foot of the bed, a silent guardian keeping the darkness at bay. One evening, Claire sat curled in a blanket on the couch, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. Max lay beside her, his nose resting on her knee. She absently ran her fingers through his fur, something that had become second nature in the past few weeks. "You were right," she murmured to Ethan. He raised an eyebrow from his spot in the kitchen. "About what?" Claire let out a small breath, barely a laugh. "Dogs aren't just animals, they're family." Ethan walked over, sitting beside her. He draped an arm around her shoulders, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Yeah," he whispered. "They are." Claire exhaled, leaning into him. Max, as if sensing the moment, let out a soft huff and nudged his nose under Claire's hand, demanding more pets. Claire smiled. "You're such a good boy, Max." The dog let out a happy sigh, his tail thumping lightly against the couch. For the first time since the diagnosis, Claire didn't feel quite as scared. She wasn't alone. She had Ethan. She had Max. And somehow she knew they would get through this together. The days passed slowly, each one marked by doctor visits, medications, and an overwhelming mix of exhaustion and hope. Claire's treatments had officially begun, and though her doctors remained optimistic, the road ahead was far from easy. Ethan did everything he could to support her, driving her to appointments, making sure she ate, keeping her company through the long, draining days. But no matter how much love he poured into his actions, there were some battles Claire had to face alone. Max, however, refused to accept that. He was always there. When Claire woke up in the morning, tired and aching, Max would rest his head in her lap, his warm brown eyes filled with quiet understanding. When the nausea from treatment hit, he'd sit by her side, his presence grounding her in a way nothing else could. And at night, when the weight of it all became too much, he'd nudge her gently, as if reminding her she wasn't alone. Claire hadn't just accepted Max's presence in her life, she had begun to need it. One evening, as Ethan cleaned up the kitchen, he heard Claire's voice from the living room. "Come here, Max." The tone was soft, affectionate in a way Ethan had rarely heard before. Peeking around the corner, he watched as Max climbed onto the couch beside Claire, his massive frame somehow fitting into the space next to her. Claire buried her fingers into his thick fur and let out a shaky breath. "You really did save me," she whispered. "I didn't deserve it, but you did." Max let out a small huff, pressing himself closer against her. He didn't understand words the way humans did, but Ethan knew. He understood her. Claire rested her forehead against Max's, tears slipping down her cheeks. Ethan swallowed hard. This was the woman who had once insisted Max stay outside. The woman who had refused to touch him, had seen him as nothing more than an inconvenience. And now here she was, holding on to him, like he was the only thing keeping her grounded. Max had done what Ethan never could. He had broken down her walls. As the weeks went on, Claire's treatment became increasingly difficult. The exhaustion weighed heavier, the side effects more relentless. Some days were good, where she could smile and laugh with Ethan, sit outside in the fresh air, and feel a little bit like herself again. Other days, she could barely lift her head off the pillow. But through it all, Max remained by her side. One morning, Ethan awoke to find Claire missing from their bed. Panic shot through him as he hurried downstairs. But the moment he stepped into the living room, the sight before him made him stop. Claire was lying on the floor, curled up with Max. The blankets from the couch had been pulled down around her, creating a small cocoon where she lay nestled against his warm fur. Max was stretched out beside her, his head resting protectively over her legs. She looked peaceful. Ethan let out a quiet breath, relief washing over him. He didn't wake her. Instead, he sat on the armrest of the couch, watching as Max gently nuzzled her with his nose, his tail giving a soft thump. Maybe this was exactly what she needed. Not words, not reassurances, just warmth, just comfort, just Max. A few weeks later, Claire sat on the hospital bed, waiting for her latest test results. Ethan was beside her, his knee bouncing anxiously, but Claire's hands were steady as they rested on Max's back. "I should be terrified right now," she admitted, scratching behind Max's ear. "But somehow I'm not." Ethan squeezed her hand. "That's because you're strong." Claire smiled, but shook her head. "No, it's because I'm not facing it alone." Before Ethan could respond, the doctor walked in, a folder in hand. Claire stiffened slightly. Ethan's grip on her hand tightened. The doctor smiled. "Your test results came back clear." The words didn't register at first. Claire blinked. "What?" "The treatment worked," the doctor said gently. "There's no sign of the cancer. You're in remission." For a second, the world seemed to stop. Then Claire let out a choked sob. Ethan pulled her into his arms, his own eyes burning with emotion. Claire trembled against him. Laughter and tears, mixing as relief flooded through her. Max, as if sensing the moment, let out a loud bark and jumped onto the hospital bed, licking Claire's face frantically. She laughed through her tears, wrapping her arms around him. "You did this," she whispered against his fur. "You saved my life." Ethan wiped at his eyes, smiling down at them. He had almost lost her, but Max had never let that happen. Later that night, as they lay in bed, Claire turned to Ethan, her fingers tracing patterns on his arm. "I used to think you were crazy," she admitted. "The way you talked about Max, how much you loved him." Ethan smirked. "I'm crazy. About both of you." Claire chuckled, but her expression softened as she reached over to scratch behind Max's ears. "I get it now," she murmured. "Dogs. They're not just animals. They're so much more." Ethan pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Yeah," he whispered. "They are." Max let out a happy sigh and curled up at their feet, and for the first time in a long time, everything felt right. The weeks following Claire's remission were filled with a strange mixture of relief and adjustment. The weight of fear had finally lifted, yet the echoes of the battle they had fought still lingered in quiet moments. Long nights where Claire would wake up, gasping for air, overwhelmed by the realization of what could have been, and silent afternoons, where Ethan would catch himself watching her too closely, as if making sure she was truly okay. But through it all, Max remained a steady, unwavering force of comfort. Claire no longer hesitated to reach for him. She no longer flinched when his fur brushed against her skin, or tensed when he nudged her hand for attention. Instead, she welcomed it. The once unwanted dog had become her greatest source of reassurance, and she was no longer afraid to show it. One morning, as Ethan finished preparing breakfast, he turned to find Claire curled up on the couch, still in her pajamas, scratching Max's belly with lazy strokes. The dog lay sprawled out beside her, his tongue lolling out in absolute bliss. Ethan grinned. "You do realize that's the same dog you used to demand stay outside, right?" Claire looked up, her expression a mixture of amusement and guilt. "Don't remind me," she muttered, shaking her head. "I was an idiot." Max wagged his tail, clearly unbothered by the past. Ethan leaned against the counter, watching them fondly. "I never thought I'd see the day where you'd voluntarily let Max cuddle you." Claire smiled softly, glancing down at the German shepherd. "I never thought I'd see the day where I'd owe my life to him," she admitted. "It kind of changes things." Ethan crossed the room and sat beside her, pressing a kiss to the side of her head. "He loves you, you know," he murmured. Claire's fingers curled deeper into Max's fur. "I love him too." Max let out a contented sigh, his tail thumping lazily against the couch. For the first time since everything had begun, Claire finally felt like she could breathe. The wedding planning resumed slowly. At first, Claire wasn't sure if she even wanted a big ceremony anymore. After everything they had been through, the idea of a grand event felt almost unnecessary. What mattered was that she and Ethan were together, that they had survived, that they had built something unbreakable. But when Ethan suggested they turn their wedding into a celebration of their journey, of the love, the struggle, the bond that had carried them through, she began to see it differently. "I just want it to feel real," Claire admitted one night, as they sat at the dining table, flipping through invitations. "I don't care about decorations or fancy seating arrangements. I just want it to feel like us." Ethan smiled, reaching for her hand. "Then that's exactly what we'll do." She hesitated for a moment, then glanced at Max, who lay by her feet. "And I want Max to be a part of it." Ethan blinked, startled by her words. "Are you serious?" Claire nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "He's family, isn't he? He deserves to be there." Ethan's heart swelled. He leaned over and kissed her deeply, unable to put into words how much it meant to him. Max lifted his head, watching them curiously. Ethan grinned. "Hear that, buddy? You're getting a tux." Max wagged his tail excitedly, oblivious to what was being planned but thrilled at the attention. Claire laughed. "Let's not push it." But Ethan had already made up his mind. Their wedding wouldn't just be a celebration of their love, it would be a tribute to the dog who had saved them both. The weeks leading up to the ceremony passed in a blur of preparations and excitement. Claire, who had once felt uncomfortable around Max, now found herself sneaking him treats when Ethan wasn't looking. She took him on walks, played fetch in the backyard, and even let him curl up beside her when she read in the evenings. One evening, as she sat cross-legged on the floor wrapping wedding favors, Max wandered over and plopped down beside her, resting his head on her lap. She smiled down at him, running her fingers through his fur. "You really are the best dog," she murmured. Max let out a happy sigh, nuzzling closer. Ethan, watching from the doorway, felt his chest tighten with emotion. He had almost lost Claire, and yet, here she was, healthy, happy, and in love with the very dog she had once rejected. If that wasn't a miracle, he didn't know what was. The morning of the wedding arrived in a flurry of activity. Claire stood in front of the mirror, smoothing down the lace of her dress, her heart pounding with anticipation. She still couldn't believe this day had finally come, not just because of the ceremony, but because she was here, alive, strong, ready to step into the future she had almost lost. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called. The door creaked open, and Ethan peeked inside, dressed in his suit. His eyes softened when he saw her. "You look beautiful," he said, voice filled with awe. Claire smiled. "You're not supposed to see me before the wedding." "I know." He stepped inside anyway, closing the door behind him. "I just wanted to say something before we walk down that aisle." She turned to face him, heart fluttering. Ethan took a deep breath. "I love you, and I'm so damn proud of you." Her throat tightened. "Ethan." He reached for her hands, squeezing them gently. "We've been through so much, and no matter what happens after today, no matter where life takes us, I just want you to know that I'll always be here. We'll always be here." He glanced toward the floor. Claire followed his gaze, and found Max sitting patiently at Ethan's feet, dressed in a tiny black bow tie. She let out a watery laugh. "Oh my God." Ethan grinned. "Told you he was getting dressed up." Max wagged his tail, looking incredibly pleased with himself. Claire dropped to her knees, wrapping her arms around him. "You're ridiculous," she murmured into his fur. "But I love you." Max licked her cheek. Ethan chuckled, watching the two of them with his heart full. He had always dreamed of a future where Claire and Max could coexist, but he had never imagined they'd love each other like this. And now, as they stood on the edge of forever, he knew without a doubt that they were exactly where they were meant to be. The wedding ceremony was nothing short of magical. The air was filled with the crisp scent of fresh flowers, the soft hum of instrumental music, and the quiet murmur of guests taking their seats. The sun filtered through the canopy of trees, casting a warm golden glow over the gathering. It was intimate, exactly as Claire had wanted, a celebration of love, resilience, and the journey they had taken to get here. Ethan stood at the altar, hands clasped together, his heartbeat erratic as he waited for Claire. He had thought he couldn't love her more than he already did, but that changed the moment he saw her walking down the aisle. She was breathtaking. The delicate lace of her dress hugged her perfectly, her hair softly curled over her shoulders, and her eyes, those eyes that had once been filled with uncertainty, now held nothing but love and certainty. And then there was Max, walking proudly beside her, his tail wagging with each step, a black satin bow tied around his neck. He held his head high as if he understood the importance of this moment, as if he knew just how much he had been a part of this love story. Claire reached the altar, her gaze locking with Ethan's as she handed her bouquet to her maid of honor. Ethan smiled down at Max, scratching behind his ear. "You're really stealing the show here, buddy," he whispered. Max gave a happy chuff before sitting obediently at Claire's feet. The officiant began speaking, but Ethan barely heard the words. His heart was too full, his focus entirely on the woman in front of him. He saw it in her eyes, the love, the gratitude, the unspoken acknowledgement that they had been through something life-changing together. When it came time to say their vows, Claire took a deep breath before speaking, her voice soft but steady. "Ethan, you have been my anchor, my greatest love, and my safe place," she said, her eyes glistening with emotion. "But before I ever realized that, before I ever let myself admit how much I loved you," Max knew. He saw it before I did, and in ways I never understood before. He brought me to you, again and again, even when I pushed away. I know now that love isn't just about choosing a person, it's about choosing a life, a family, and I choose you. I choose Max. I choose the love that saved me. Always. A soft murmur rippled through the crowd. Even the officiant looked momentarily moved. Ethan exhaled shakily, smiling through the emotion welling in his chest. "Claire," he began, his voice thick, "I loved you from the moment I met you, but I don't think I truly understood what it meant to love you until we went through everything we did. You showed me what it means to fight for a future, to hold on even when it's hard, and as much as I'd love to take all the credit for bringing us together, I think we both know Max had a paw in that." The guests chuckled softly. "So today I make a promise not just to you, but to our family, to love you, to cherish you, to walk through every hardship with you, and yes, to always make room on the bed for Max." Claire laughed through her tears, shaking her head. The officiant smiled. "By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." Ethan wasted no time, pulling Claire into a deep, passionate kiss. The cheers and applause rang around them, but all he could focus on was the way she melted into him, the way she felt so perfectly at home in his arms. And then, just as the moment settled, Max let out a loud, celebratory bark. The guests burst into laughter. Claire pulled away just enough to look down at Max. "You happy now?" she teased. Max wagged his tail enthusiastically, and Ethan couldn't help but laugh. As they walked back down the aisle, now husband and wife, Max trotted proudly beside them. This wasn't just their wedding, it was the start of something bigger, a family. The reception was warm, full of love and laughter. Friends and family surrounded them, celebrating the journey that had led to this moment. Ethan and Claire took turns greeting guests, dancing under the soft twinkle of fairy lights, and sneaking moments alone where they could simply breathe each other in. But the real highlight of the evening, Max. Wherever they went, Max was there, receiving pets, sneaking bites of food from willing guests, and sitting proudly beside Claire, as if to say, asterisk, "Yes, she's mine too now." Asterisk. At one point in the evening, Claire sat with a plate of cake, absently running her fingers through Max's fur. "You're really enjoying this, aren't you?" she mused. Max wagged his tail, his eyes full of adoration. Ethan sat down beside her, draping an arm over her shoulders. "You know, I always hoped you'd love him one day, but I never expected this." Claire glanced at him, her expression soft. "I don't think I ever had a choice," she admitted. "He's impossible not to love." Ethan kissed her temple. "Welcome to the rest of your life." Max let out a happy sigh, resting his head in Claire's lap, and in that moment, everything felt perfect. The honeymoon phase of marriage wasn't just a cliché, it was real. and Claire and Ethan were soaking up every second of it. Their house, once a place of quiet companionship between Ethan and Max, was now filled with warmth, laughter, and the occasional playful argument over whose turn it was to take out the trash. Claire had seamlessly become part of their little world, and even Max, who had once been skeptical of her presence, was now glued to her side. Every morning he followed Claire into the kitchen as she brewed coffee, his tail wagging expectantly for his morning head rub. Every evening he curled up at her feet while she read on the couch, his deep sighs of contentment filling the room. It was a quiet, unspoken understanding. They were family now. But there was one thing still missing. One evening, as they sat on the porch, the golden hues of sunset spilling over the yard, Claire leaned her head against Ethan's shoulder and sighed. "Do you ever think about getting another dog?" she asked, her voice thoughtful. Ethan turned to look at her, surprised. "You want another dog?" Claire chuckled, nudging him playfully. Okay, I know. A year ago I never would have imagined myself saying that. But," she glanced down at Max, who lay sprawled on the wooden floor beside them. "He's getting older, and I just feel like, maybe it's time. Maybe we should give him some company." Ethan's heart swelled at the thought. Not because he had wanted another dog. He would have been content with just Max forever. But because Claire had changed so much. She had gone from someone who saw dogs as an inconvenience to someone who wanted to bring another into their home. And the best part, she wasn't doing it for Ethan, she was doing it for Max. "Are you serious?" Ethan asked, searching her face for hesitation. Claire nodded, dead serious. A slow smile spread across Ethan's face. "Well, I guess we're going to the shelter this weekend." Max's ears perked up at the word shelter, though he had no idea what was coming. Saturday arrived, and they made their way to the local rescue shelter. The smell of dog fur and kibble greeted them as they stepped inside, the sound of excited barking echoing through the halls. Claire instinctively reached for Ethan's hand, squeezing it as they walked past the rows of kennels. A woman with kind eyes and a clipboard approached them. "Looking to adopt today?" she asked, smiling. "Yes," Claire said confidently. "We have a dog at home, and we're looking for a companion for him." The woman nodded, leading them toward an open play area where dogs were being let out one by one to interact with potential adopters. Claire scanned the group of dogs, her heart aching at how many of them needed homes. Ethan watched her carefully, noticing how different she was from the woman he had met years ago, the one who couldn't understand why people were so attached to their pets. Now she was the one crouching down, letting eager dogs nuzzle into her hands, whispering soft reassurances to them. And then, it happened. A small, wiry-haired pup with caramel-colored fur and the biggest brown eyes trotted toward Claire, tail wagging uncertainly. He wasn't as bold as the others, hanging back slightly, watching her with quiet curiosity. Claire extended her hand. "Hey there, sweetheart," she murmured. The pup inched closer, sniffed her fingers, then, as if deciding he trusted her, he leaned against her legs with a heavy sigh. Claire's heart melted. "I think we found him," she whispered, looking up at Ethan. Ethan knelt beside her, scratching behind the pup's ears. "You sure?" Claire nodded. "He needs us." The woman from the shelter smiled. "That's Benny. He's been here the longest. Came in as a stray, very skittish at first. But he's a sweetheart once he warms up." Claire ran her fingers through Benny's scruffy fur. "Max is going to love him." Ethan chuckled, or at least tolerate him. Benny looked up at them with trusting eyes, as if he somehow knew his life had just changed forever. Introducing Benny to Max was an event. When they arrived home, Max immediately perked up, sniffing the air as if sensing something new. His tail wagged cautiously as Ethan opened the door, letting Benny step inside. The small pup hesitated at first, glancing up at Claire for reassurance. "It's okay," she said gently, giving him a small nudge. Max padded forward, nose twitching as he circled the newcomer, sniffing him thoroughly. Benny stood perfectly still, letting Max investigate, his tail giving the smallest hesitant wag. Ethan held his breath, waiting, and then Max let out a huff, as if saying, "Asterisk. All right, you're cool, asterisk," before trotting off to his usual spot by the couch. Benny followed. Claire let out a breath of relief. That went better than expected. Ethan grinned. Give it a week. They'll be inseparable. And he was right. Within days, Max and Benny were sharing food bowls, curling up together on the rug, and chasing each other around the backyard. Benny's nervousness faded as Max took him under his wing, showing him the ropes, where to nap, where the best sunspots were, and of course, where the treats were kept. One night, as Claire sat on the floor, Benny curled up in her lap while Max lay beside her. She ran her hands through their fur, feeling the steady rhythm of their breathing. Ethan watched her from the couch, his heart full. You're really a dog person now, huh? He teased. Claire glanced up at him, her eyes soft. I think I always was, I just didn't know it. Ethan reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. I love you. Claire smiled. I love you too. Max let out a happy sigh. Benny wiggled deeper into Claire's lap, and for the first time in her life, Claire finally understood. Dogs weren't just pets, they were family. The days turned into weeks, and Benny became an inseparable part of their family. Max, once an only child, had taken to his new role as an older brother with surprising patience. He tolerated Benny's endless curiosity, even when the smaller dog chewed on his ears or tried to steal his spot on the couch. Their home, once a quiet place where Max waited patiently for Ethan to return from work, was now filled with the sound of playful barking, the scampering of paws against hardwood floors, and Claire's laughter. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset over their backyard, Ethan glanced at Claire and saw something in her expression, something thoughtful, distant. What are you thinking about? He asked. Claire hesitated, running her fingers through Benny's fur as he lay in her lap. She took a deep breath. I can't believe how much has changed. Ethan squeezed her hand. You mean us? She nodded. Us, me, Max, everything. Her lips curled into a soft smile. I used to think dogs were just pets, something people had for company, maybe protection. But now, she exhaled, glancing at Max, who lay sprawled beside Ethan, and then down at Benny, who nuzzled against her. Now I get it. Ethan didn't need to ask what she meant. He could see it in the way she held Benny, in the way she looked at Max. She had changed in ways neither of them had expected, and for the better. Claire turned to Ethan, eyes bright. Do you ever think about what's next? Ethan raised an eyebrow. Like, buying another dog? Because I think Max would file a complaint. Claire laughed. No, not another dog. I mean, the future, our future. Ethan tilted his head. Like starting a family. Claire bit her lip, nodding. Yeah. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He had always wanted children, but he never wanted to pressure Claire, especially after everything they had been through. Are you saying you're ready? Claire looked down at Benny, then at Max, and finally at Ethan. I think I am. Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with the weight of something beautiful, something new. Ethan reached for her, pulling her into a tight embrace. I think we'd make pretty great parents, he murmured. Claire chuckled against his chest. I mean, we've already raised two pretty great dogs. Max let out a satisfied sigh. Benny wagged his tail, oblivious to the life-changing conversation happening around him. Months passed, and life continued in its quiet, beautiful rhythm. Claire's routine now included early morning walks with Max and Benny, something she had never imagined enjoying. She found peace in the simple act of sipping coffee on the porch with Ethan while their dogs played in the yard. She had never known that this kind of happiness, the simple, everyday kind, was what she had been searching for all along. Then one morning, everything changed. Ethan was in the kitchen making breakfast when he heard Claire gasp from the bathroom. He turned quickly, concern flashing in his eyes. Claire, you okay? Silence. Then Claire emerged, a small, trembling smile on her face. Ethan's heart pounded. What's wrong? Claire held up something in her hand. A pregnancy test. Positive. For a moment they just stared at each other, neither speaking. Then Ethan broke into the biggest grin of his life. Are you serious? Claire laughed, tears welling in her eyes. I guess Max wasn't the only one with instincts. Ethan pulled her into his arms, spinning her around as laughter and joy filled the room. Max and Benny, sensing the excitement, jumped around them, barking happily. Claire wiped her tears and looked down at Max, her heart swelling with gratitude. You saved my life, she whispered. And now you're going to be a big brother. Max tilted his head, as if he understood, before stepping forward and licking Claire's hand. Benny, not wanting to be left out, wiggled between them and let out an excited bark. Ethan cupped Claire's face, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "We're going to be parents." Claire nodded, laughing softly. "Yeah, and Max and Benny are going to have a new little human to protect." The thought was almost overwhelming. The woman who once refused to let a dog near her was now standing here, with 2 dogs at her feet, preparing for the biggest adventure of her life, a family. 9 months later, the hospital room was filled with the soft cries of a newborn. Ethan sat beside Claire, holding their tiny daughter in his arms. Claire, exhausted but glowing with happiness, watched as their baby gripped Ethan's finger with her impossibly small hand. Ethan looked down at their daughter, his heart nearly bursting. "She's perfect." Claire smiled. "She is." When they brought her home, Max and Benny were waiting anxiously by the door. The moment Ethan stepped inside, Max's ears perked up, and he carefully approached, sniffing the baby with cautious curiosity. Claire knelt beside him. "Meet Lily," she whispered. Max let out a soft, approving huff. Benny wagged his tail excitedly, trying to climb onto Ethan's lap to get a better look. As the months passed, Lily grew up surrounded by love, not just from her parents but from Max and Benny, who watched over her with the same devotion they had always shown. One evening, as Claire rocked Lily to sleep, she looked over at Ethan and whispered, "You were right." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "About what?" Claire glanced at Max and Benny, then at their sleeping daughter. "Dogs aren't just pets, they're family." Ethan smiled, reaching over to squeeze her hand.
Yeah.
"And I think Max knew that all along." Max let out a content sigh, resting his head on the floor beside Lily's crib. Benny curled up beside him, tail flicking once before settling. And in that moment, Claire knew this was exactly where she was meant to be. The autumn air was crisp as Claire fastened Lily into her stroller, wrapping a soft blanket around the toddler before stepping outside with Benny trotting excitedly beside her. Max, ever watchful, walked beside them with his usual dignified gait, his ears perked and his eyes scanning the quiet suburban street. Claire had grown to love these evening walks with her daughter and their dogs, something she never would have imagined just a year ago. It gave her a sense of peace, a moment to breathe and take in the simple joys of life. As they strolled down the sidewalk, Claire found herself smiling as she watched Lily giggle at Benny, who bounced happily along, playfully nipping at Max's tail. The big German shepherd, ever the patient older brother, tolerated the younger dog's antics with quiet amusement. The street was lined with golden-leafed trees, their branches swaying gently in the breeze, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. Then, the air changed. Max suddenly tensed beside her, his body going rigid as his ears flicked forward, eyes locking onto something in the distance. A deep, low growl rumbled in his throat, a sound Claire had learned to trust. She barely had a second to process it before the distant roar of an engine shattered the quiet evening. The sound grew louder, too loud, too fast. Claire turned her head just in time to see a car barreling down the narrow street, its tires screeching as it lost control. Her heart stopped. The car was coming straight toward them. Everything happened in an instant, yet it felt like slow motion. Claire reached for the stroller instinctively, her body moving before her mind could fully register the danger. But she wasn't fast enough. Max was. With a powerful lunge, Max slammed his body into Claire, knocking her and the stroller out of the way. Just as the speeding car swerved onto the sidewalk, Claire hit the pavement hard, her elbow scraping against the rough concrete. Lily let out a startled cry, but she was safe. The stroller had tipped over onto the grass, away from the street. But Max, a sickening thud filled the air. The car clipped Max's hind leg before it swerved back onto the road, its tires screeching as the driver fought to regain control. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the vehicle disappeared around the corner, leaving nothing behind but the echo of its recklessness. Claire scrambled to her feet, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Max, the German shepherd, lay sprawled on the pavement, his massive body still, his breathing shallow. Benny whimpered, nudging at his unmoving brother, while Lily sobbed in the stroller, sensing something was terribly wrong. "Max, no, no, no," Claire whispered, falling to her knees beside him, her hands hovering helplessly over his body. She fumbled for her phone with trembling fingers, her heart pounding so hard she could barely hear herself think. Ethan. She needed to call Ethan. She pressed the button for his number, and he picked up on the first ring. Claire. His voice was cheerful, unaware. Hey, what's up, Ethan? She gasped, her voice breaking. It's Max. He's hurt. A car. I'm on my way, Ethan said instantly, all warmth vanishing from his tone. Hang on. She didn't realize she was crying until she felt the warm tears streaming down her face. The drive to the emergency vet was the longest of Claire's life. Ethan broke every speed limit, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, as Claire sat in the back seat with Max's head cradled in her lap. His eyes fluttered open every few seconds before slipping shut again, and every time they did, Claire's chest tightened with fear. Stay with me, buddy, she whispered, running her fingers through his thick fur. Please, Max. Benny, sensing the distress, curled up beside Max, whining softly, as if urging him to fight. Even Lily, too young to understand what was happening, had quieted, her small fingers gripping Max's ear in an innocent attempt to comfort him. When they arrived at the vet, Ethan carried Max inside, his strong arms barely masking the desperation in his movements. The vet techs rushed forward immediately, and within seconds, Max was whisked away into the emergency room, leaving the family standing there, helpless. The waiting was unbearable. Claire sat in the lobby, holding Lily in her lap, while Ethan paced back and forth, running a hand through his hair repeatedly. Benny lay at Claire's feet, unmoving, his ears pinned back as he stared at the closed exam room door. Minutes stretched into an hour, then two. Finally, the vet emerged, looking exhausted but calm. He made it through surgery, she said, and Claire felt her legs nearly give out with relief. The impact caused internal bruising, and his leg took most of the hit, but we were able to stabilize him. He's going to need time to recover, but he's strong. I think he's going to be okay. Claire let out a shaky breath, pressing a hand over her mouth to stifle the sob that threatened to escape. Ethan pulled her close, pressing a kiss to the top of her head before whispering, "He's a fighter, just like you." For the next few weeks, their world revolved around Max's recovery. Ethan set up a special area in the living room, with soft bedding, and all of Max's favorite things. Benny refused to leave Max's side, curling up beside him every night, as if watching over him. Claire found herself sitting with Max for hours, gently stroking his fur as she whispered words of encouragement. And when he finally stood on his own again, wobbly but determined, she was the first to kneel down and press a kiss to his forehead, just like she had on their wedding day. "I love you, Max," she murmured. His tail thumped weakly against the floor, but the look in his eyes said it all. He had protected her, just like he always had, and now she would protect him too. As the months passed, things slowly returned to normal, but Claire knew they would never be the same. Not in a bad way, but in a way that meant their hearts had grown even bigger. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Claire sat in the backyard watching Max and Benny chase each other across the grass. Lily giggled from her spot in Ethan's arms, clapping as Max playfully nudged Benny. Claire turned to Ethan and smiled. "You were right," she said softly. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "About what?" Claire glanced back at Max, her heart swelling. "Dogs aren't just pets," she said. "They're family." Max, as if understanding, trotted over and lay down beside her, resting his head in her lap with a content sigh. And for the first time in a long time, Claire knew without a doubt, she had everything she ever needed.